Hello and welcome to The Left Field, where we explore all sorts of fascinating ideas that mostly don't find their way into mainstream culture. My name's Benjamin, and for this video I have prepared an essay on the subject of David Bohm's and Paul Feyerabend's philosophy of science for you. If you like science and philosophy and you enjoy asking deep questions, you have come to the right place. Let's get right to it. This essay aims to show that David Bohm's alternative interpretation of quantum mechanics had a profound influence on the development of Paul Feyerabend's philosophical ideas as presented in his book Against Method. I will show that Feyerabend's arguments for pluralism in science were largely developed in discussions with quantum physicist David Bohm, whose alternative approach to quantum mechanics faced dogmatic dismissal by most of the leading physicists at the time, and that the development of Feyerabend's arguments was directly influenced by his objections to the dogmatism he witnessed in the debates surrounding quantum physics during that period. In order to do this, I will first give a brief summary of Feyerabend's ideas as presented in the first two chapters of Against Method, as well as examining the role that quantum theory played in his early career. I will then give a brief introduction to Bohm's work in physics and philosophy, giving particular attention to his hidden variable interpretation of quantum mechanics and its reception among the physics community at the time. Afterwards, I will show how Bohm influenced Feyerabend's thinking by taking a closer look at the events of the Colston Symposium of 1957 and their personal connection as colleagues in Bristol. Finally, I will be pointing out some of the striking similarities in their views on the philosophy of science by comparing select quotations from Feyerabend's Against Method and Bohm's Wholeness in the Implicate order. In the first two chapters of his book Against Method, Feyerabend argues that there cannot be any strict, unchanging, binding principles when it comes to the business of science. He comes to this conclusion largely as a result of his investigation of the history of science, citing developments such as the invention of atomism, the Copernican revolution, kinetic theory, quantum theory, and the wave theory of light as examples where thinkers intentionally or unintentionally broke certain methodological rules that were in place at the time. Had they not done so, no progress would have been made. Therefore, he argues, this kind of liberal practice is both reasonable and necessary for the growth of knowledge. Looking at the evolution of science throughout history, the idea of a fixed method or theory of rationality is too naive and a result of a desire to please lower instincts, namely, quote, intellectual security in the form of clarity, precision, objectivity, and truth. Instead, Feyerabend famously states, "There is only one principle that can be defended under all circumstances and in all stages of human development. It is the principle, anything goes." Feyerabend decidedly defends the feasibility of working counterinductively. In particular, he argues that developing hypotheses inconsistent with both accepted theories on the one hand and well-established facts on the other is a fruitful endeavor. Scientists should adopt a pluralistic methodology in order to understand their views as best they can, as analysis alone is not sufficient to find all the important formal properties of a theory. Progress can be made by contrasting different ideas rather than with experience only. However, Feyerabend makes it clear that his aim is, quote, not to replace one set of general rules by another such set. My intention is, rather, to convince the reader that all methodologies, even the most obvious ones, have their limits. I would now like to talk about the role of quantum mechanics in the development of Feyerabend's philosophy of science a bit. Feyerabend dedicated a considerable amount of time to working on the foundations of the quantum theory in the first 2 decades of his career. He studied physics in Vienna, and only after getting stuck during his doctoral research, he wrote a PhD dissertation in philosophy instead. Nevertheless, quantum mechanics remained one of his chief interests, and many of his early writings deal with this subject. Feyerabend had a profound knowledge of the theory and the debates surrounding it, and this heavily influenced his views on science in general. One of the more controversial debates he was interested in revolved around David Bohm's so-called hidden variable interpretation of quantum mechanics, which I will be examining next. In 1952, David Bohm published an alternative interpretation of the quantum theory. His approach differs from the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation as outlined by Niels Bohr in that it is deterministic, and particles have a well-defined position at all times. Because it adds to the existing theories variables at a subquantum level which are as of yet unobservable, it is also known as a hidden variable theory. Bohm believed his theory to be useful in the treatment of new physical problems, particularly those arising in the domain of very short distances, 10 to the power of minus 13 centimeters or less, and of very high energies, 10 to the power of 9 electron volts or more. Apart from possible advances in physics, and perhaps even more importantly for Bohm, his interpretation had radical implications for how the notion of reality had to be conceived. Bohm believed that his theory pointed towards a reality which was never static or complete, but an unending process of movement and unfoldment, considering, quote, the unbroken wholeness of the totality of existence as an undivided flowing movement without borders, thereby rejecting the notion of materialism. In Bohm's view, quote, the idea of a separately and independently existent particle is seen to be, at best, an abstraction furnishing a valid approximation only in a certain limited domain. Thus, he identified fragmentation in all aspects of life, the notion of reality as an aggregate of separately existing particles, the division of art, science, technology, and all human work into specialties, the breaking up of society as a whole into separate nations, religions, economic and racial groups, etc., as the underlying cause for the many crises humanity is facing today. Here's another quote. The notion that all these fragments are separately existing is evidently an illusion, and this illusion cannot do other than lead to endless conflict and confusion. Indeed, the attempt to live according to the notion that the fragments are really separate is, in essence, what has led to the growing series of extremely urgent crises that is confronting us today. Thus, as is now well known, this way of life has brought about pollution, destruction of the balance of nature, overpopulation, worldwide economic and political disorder, and the creation of an overall environment that is neither physically nor mentally healthy for most of the people who have to live in it. As we shall see in the next section, this radical critique of the, as Bohm calls it, fragmentary self-worldview, with its emphasis on materialism and individualism, did not sit well with many of Bohm's contemporaries, both in the physics community and the political establishment at the time. The main technical objections raised against the possibility of a hidden variable theory, which are the difficulties of dealing with the Heisenberg indeterminacy relations, the quantization of action, the paradox of Einstein and Podolsky, and von Neumann's arguments against the possibility of such variables, had all been refuted by Bohm. And even though his theory gives precisely the same experimental predictions as the Copenhagen interpretation, with the exception of a small circle of French physicists around Louis de Broglie and Jean-Paul Vigier in Paris, reception of his theory was rather poor. In fact, many of the proponents of the Copenhagen interpretation felt obliged to attack Bohm and anyone who would express their affinity for his ideas with a remarkable passion and hostility. Physicists Leon Rosenfeld, a close collaborator of Niels Bohr, and Wolfgang Pauli were especially committed in their effort to curb Bohm's influence. They were afraid especially of the appeal of hidden variables to younger colleagues. Bohm's theory was criticized and mocked as a, quote, communist Catholic conspiracy, juvenile deviationism, or a disquieting sign of primitive mentality. And he was personally attacked as being a, quote, hopeless fool, a Trotskyite, and even a traitor. As a result of the continued effort of Rosenfeld, Pauli and their allies around the world to put Bohm's unorthodox ideas into place, the feeling among the physics community at the time was that Bohm was, quote, slayed not only philosophically but physically as well. His being, quote, doubly excommunicated from the United States by McCarthyism and from the Copenhagen Church resulted in his personal and intellectual isolation from the physics community, causing much grief for Bohm. The climate of hostility towards his ideas was so extreme that a promising 29-year-old mathematician named John Nash angrily complained to Robert Oppenheimer in a letter. Probably my speaking in such a way is due to a reaction against the attitude of most of the physicists, also some mathematicians who have studied quantum theory, to whom I have spoken. They seem quite too dogmatic in their attitudes. If one expresses any sort of questioning attitude or a belief in hidden parameters, they often simply treat one as a stupid or at best quite ignorant person. Now that we have a basic overview of Feyerabend's and Bohm's ideas, and hopefully gotten a bit of a feel for the atmosphere around the debate on hidden variables, let us turn to the main part of this essay, in which we are going to find out how Bohm influenced Feyerabend's philosophy of science as outlined in Against Method. In 1957, David Bohm attended the 9th Symposium of the Colston Research Society in Bristol, a conference bringing together philosophers and physicists to discuss quantum mechanics. Feyerabend, who was a visiting fellow in Bristol at the time, helped organize the event. At the conference, Bohm gave a lecture on his hidden variable theory, which was followed by a talk by the previously mentioned Leon Rosenfeld, who was extremely dismissive of Bohm's ideas. In his talk, instead of examining the actual content of Bohm's hidden variable theory, he argued that interpretations given to physical theories were always unique, and that no such thing as an alternative interpretation to a physical theory was possible, even in principle. Rosenfeld's talk was not well received by the audience, even by other proponents of the Copenhagen interpretation, and led to a discussion on the role of speculation and the desirability of alternative approaches in physics. This meant a significant victory for Bohm and his supporters, and a turning point in the reception of his work. Feyerabend thus witnessed how Bohm's alternative interpretation of quantum mechanics was met with a dogmatic dismissal by a leading physicist. The impact this occasion had on his thinking is shown by the fact that Feyerabend quoted Rosenfeld's response to Bohm on numerous occasions as an example of dogmatism in quantum physics. It seems very likely that Feyerabend has Rosenfeld's talk in mind when he writes in the first chapter of Against Method, quote, "The practicing scientist will defend his concentration on a single theory to the exclusion of empirically possible alternatives." For Feyerabend, the events of the Colston Symposium resulted in an increased appreciation of Bohm's work. This appreciation intensified when only a few months after the conference, Bohm moved to Bristol to take up a position in the university's physics department. Due to his introverted and non-competitive nature, Bohm, quote, felt a bit uneasy with the sort of pecking order in Bristol, the social emphasis on status and the people there, end quote, and he had a particular dislike for the, quote, acerbic personality, end quote, of Maurice Price, the head of the physics department. Luckily, Bohm found a kindred spirit in Feyerabend, who found the environment in Bristol, and especially Price, equally unpleasant. They engaged in regular discussions, of which Bohm said that both of them found, quote, discussing the philosophy of science and philosophy more generally, helpful to make the thing more tolerable, end quote. During their time together in Bristol, Bohm was able to convince Feyerabend of the feasibility of his theory. Consequently, Feyerabend supported Bohm in his arguing for the need to develop alternative interpretations to quantum mechanics. Indeed, there are many striking similarities to be found in the arguments put forth by Feyerabend in Against Method and those of Bohm in Wholeness and the Implicate Order. In order to convey a better idea of what exactly the discussions in Bristol might have been about, and to illustrate the influence of Bohm's ideas on Against Method, I will be quoting extensively from both thinkers in the following section. The first similarity I would like to point out deals with the notion of the scientific fact. Feyerabend argues that there can be no such thing as an objective scientific fact independent from our theories and beliefs. Quote, the history of science, after all, does not just consist of facts and conclusions drawn from facts. It also contains ideas, interpretations of facts, problems created by conflicting interpretations, mistakes, and so on. On closer analysis, we even find that science knows no bare facts at all, but that the facts that enter our knowledge are already viewed in a certain way and are, therefore, essentially ideational. This sentiment is shared by Bohm, who essentially makes the same point in slightly different terms. Quote, it is important to note that facts are not to be considered as if they were independently existent objects that we might find or pick up in the laboratory. Rather, as the Latin root of the word facere indicates, the fact is what has been made, for example as in manufacture. Thus, in a certain sense, we make the fact. That is to say, beginning with immediate perception of an actual situation, we develop the fact by giving it further order, form, and structure with the aid of our theoretical concepts. The second related similarity deals with the nature of theory and knowledge. Feyerabend argues that our theories are not to be regarded as a gradual approach to absolute truth, but instead as mere fairy tales, all of them contributing to the evolution of consciousness by way of competing against each other. Quote, knowledge so conceived is not a series of self-consistent theories that converges toward an ideal view. It is not a gradual approach to the truth. It is rather an ever-increasing ocean of mutually incompatible alternatives, each single theory, each fairy tale, each myth that is part of the collection forcing the others into greater articulation, and all of them contributing, via this process of competition, to the development of our consciousness. Nothing is ever settled, no view can ever be omitted from a comprehensive account. Again, Bohm makes exactly the same point. He too argues that our theories are merely different ways of looking at the world, some of which are clearer and more appropriate than others in certain respects, but none of them ever so final or complete that they would correspond to absolute truth. Quote, so, instead of supposing that older theories are falsified at a certain point in time, we merely say that man is continually developing new forms of insight, which are clear up to a point and then tend to become unclear. In this activity, there is evidently no reason to suppose that there is or will be a final form of insight corresponding to absolute truth, or even a steady series of approximations to this. Rather, in the nature of the case, one may expect the unending development of new forms of insight, which will, however, assimilate certain key features of the older forms as simplifications, in the way that relativity theory does with Newtonian theory. The third similarity lies in the historical analysis of the evolution of science. Feyerabend points out that, on many occasions, groundbreaking scientific progress was made not because thinkers adhered to the methodological rules of their time, but precisely because they broke them. Quote, "Indeed, one of the most striking features of recent discussions in the history and philosophy of science is the realization that events and developments, such as the invention of atomism in antiquity, the Copernican revolution, the rise of modern atomism, kinetic theory, dispersion theory, stereochemistry, quantum theory, the gradual emergence of the wave theory of light, occurred only because some thinkers either decided not to be bound by certain obvious methodological rules, or because they unwillingly broke them." Bohm points out the same thing in his discussion of the notion of order in the 5th chapter of Wholeness in the Implicate Order. He brings attention to the fact that historically there has been a remarkable tendency in science to fit new observations into the already existing order, even when the new evidence seems to be contradicting it. Like Feyerabend, he uses the Copernican revolution as an example where decisive progress was made only when the relevance of the old order was questioned altogether. Quote, "To be sure, when more detailed observations were made on the planets, it was found that their orbits are not actually perfect circles, but this fact was accommodated within the prevailing notions of order by considering the orbits of planets as superpositions of epicycles, that is, circles within circles. Thus, one sees an example of the remarkable capacity for adaptation within a given notion of order. With the aid of such adaptations, men could for thousands of years look at the night sky and see epicycles there, almost independently of the detailed content of their observations. It seems clear then that a basic notion of order, such as was expressed in terms of epicycles, could never be decisively contradicted because it could always be adjusted to fit the observed facts. But eventually, a new spirit arose in scientific research, which led to the questioning of the relevance of the old order, notably by Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. As a result of this historical analysis, and this is the final similarity I want to point out, Bohm draws the same conclusions as Feyerabend when it comes to the methodology of science. Feyerabend argues that, quote, "a complex medium containing surprising and unforeseen developments demands complex procedures and defies analysis on the basis of rules which have been set up in advance and without regard to the ever-changing conditions of history." End quote. Bohm echoes this sentiment. In his view, science at its most original happens when the relevance of old orders is questioned, and this can be done at any time. Quote, "Clearly, such perception can appropriately take place at almost any time, and does not have to be restricted to unusual and revolutionary periods, in which one finds that the older orders can no longer be conveniently adapted to the facts. To work in this way is evidently to give primary emphasis to something similar to artistic perception. It does not begin with abstract preconceptions as to what the order has to be, which are then adapted to the order that is observed." End quote. Now in conclusion, we have seen that Bohm's alternative account of quantum mechanics had a profound influence on the development of Feyerabend's arguments for pluralism in science, as presented in Against Method. I have shown that the debates surrounding the possibility of hidden variables, the fierce rejection of Bohm's ideas by a large part of the physics community in spite of its empirical possibility, and most importantly, the events of the Colston Symposium of 1957, as well as Bohm's and Feyerabend's time as colleagues in Bristol, profoundly shaped Feyerabend's thinking and laid the foundation for his philosophy of science, and that this influence is reflected also in the striking similarity of many of the arguments put forth by the two thinkers in their respective works. That's the end of the essay. Now, let me add some closing remarks. If you have made it this far, don't switch off now, because this final part of the video is the one which will provide the most value to you. First of all, thank you and congratulations for making it through. I did not intend to make a video essay out of this paper originally, and that's why it is written in an academic style, and I imagine it could be quite dry and hard to follow if you're not familiar with the subject. Nevertheless, I tried my best to speak as slowly and clearly as possible and present the information in an entertaining fashion. Most of my future essays will be a lot less academic and more geared towards a YouTube audience and the video essay format. However, this does not mean that the topics I'll be covering will be any less profound. On the contrary, this is just the beginning. Now on to the juicy part. I want to give you some suggestions as to what to do with the information you just received. First of all, if you found this essay interesting, I'd recommend you do some further reading. Most of the quotes in this essay are taken from Feyerabend's Against Method and Bohm's Wholeness and the Implicate Order. Both of these books are very enjoyable and packed with fascinating ideas. Bear in mind though that Bohm's book especially is quite a challenging read, and you should be prepared to spend a lot of time with it and take notes in order to really understand and internalize what he's saying. I would also suggest you read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This is a classic text of the philosophy of science, and it's somewhat of a precursor to Against Method. It will give you an even greater understanding and provide you with some more context for the notions that we explored together in this essay. May I also suggest David Bohm's Thought as a System if you're interested in Bohm's philosophical work apart from his hidden variable theory in physics. Again, this is a challenging read, but it will absolutely blow your mind and change the way you think about thinking forever, I promise. Also, have a look at the sources to this essay, which are listed in the video description. If you're interested in some of the smaller details of the essay, like let's say you wanted to know more about the Colston Symposium and what exactly happened there, you would find that information in these sources. Finally, the most important part. This might be obvious to some of you, but I want to stress it nonetheless. When you study a topic like this, the greatest value comes not from you simply absorbing the information that is presented to you. If you want to get the most value out of this essay, you need to contemplate these issues yourself. Let me suggest a few questions to get you started. Number 1. What is science? Now, this question alone you could contemplate for hundreds of hours, and it would be very much worth your time. I have to warn you though, you might come to some pretty radical conclusions. Number 2. Looking back at how science has evolved in the past, what might the science of the future look like? Number 3. What measures can be taken to reduce the dangers of dogmatism and ideology corrupting science? Number 4. If anything goes, how do we tell the shit from the shinola? And by that I mean if we have no fixed criteria like the notion of falsifiability, for example, to distinguish good science from bad science or science from non-science, how do we know which ideas are worth considering and which are just, bullshit? Number 5. Can you imagine a reality that is not static or complete, not made of elementary particles, but instead an unending process of movement and unfoldment, as Bohm calls it? You are probably going to struggle with this, just because the notion of an objective material reality is so ingrained within us due to the culture we grew up in, it sort of goes against our common sense. But try it nonetheless. Look around you, wherever you are, and imagine that all the objects you see are not really separately existing, but part of one and the same whole, undivided, flowing process. Can you do it? Number 6. What would be the implications of such a notion of reality for human beings on individual and collective levels? How would it affect our values? How would it affect the way we do politics? How would it affect the way we think about our relationship to nature, and so on and so forth? Now, these are just starting points to get you going. There is an endless amount of questions you could ask, and I encourage you to come up with your own ones. Coming up with good questions is an extremely important and useful skill to have in all areas of life, actually. Contemplating these sorts of questions will help you to train your independent thinking, and God knows we desperately need more of that nowadays. If you're interested in deep philosophical issues like these, well, I'm sure that you've realized by now that you're kind of a rare breed, and quite frankly, we need you. We need people like you to not get distracted by all the cultural noise around you, by social media, by news, TV, video games, etc., but instead to use your gifts to do lots of reading, writing, studying, and contemplating, so you can contribute to the evolution of our global consciousness. Don't cheat us out of your contribution. I really want to stress that these are important issues. I know many subjects in academic philosophy can seem quite arcane and useless, and in many cases I agree, actually. But this is not one of them. This is really important. This is about how we do science. And how we do science, how we evolve science, has huge implications for the whole of society. Likewise, if the default worldview for most of us shifted from philosophical materialism to a reality considered as undivided, flowing movement, this would fundamentally change the way we relate to other human beings, to animals, to plants, and to nature as a whole. Literally billions of human and non-human lives would be changed, and I believe for the better, if in our society there were a widespread recognition of the sorts of ideas that Bohm and Feyerabend talk about. This is why I made this essay. I want to expose you to new ideas that you might not have heard before, that help you to open your mind, to think independently, and which you can use to improve not just your own life, but that of all living beings if you apply them properly. Alright, that's it for now. If you have any questions, suggestions, or anything else you would like to express, don't hesitate to leave a message in the comment section. I hope you liked it, and if so, please do click the like and subscribe buttons. I really appreciate it a lot, and I'll see you very soon in the next one. Bye bye.